In today's self-paced lesson, we're going to look at a number of primary sources to investigate several questions about Mansa Musa, his wealth, and where all this gold came from. The first thing we need to do is take a look at the glossary that is attached to today's assignment. And so you have this glossary available to you as well. And the first definition says primary source. So let's take a second and make sure that we're all on the same page about what a primary source is. And you'll see here that it says a source of information, a diary, a document, a manuscript, or other artifact that was created at the time being studied. That means that a primary source is something that comes directly from the time period, not something that was written decades later or centuries later, but rather it could be something like a diary, a letter, a newspaper, or it could be a history as long as it was written by someone living and experiencing those events at the time that they were happening. All right, let's return now that we have a clear understanding of what a primary source is. What are we using these sources today to investigate? So what we're looking for today as we go through the different excerpts that we have from primary sources written at the time, meaning around the 1330s or shortly thereafter, Mansa Musa's Hajj, are these three central questions for investigation. Number one, what motivated Mansa Musa to undertake this pilgrimage in the first place? Why did he go? Number two, how do we know about the wealth that Mansa Musa's entourage gifted and spent along their journey? Was he really as rich as he's depicted? And number three, where did all this gold come from? As we go through this lesson, each time you are given a source, you are going to be given the question at the top of the screen as well to help guide your investigation. So you're going to want to keep open that glossary we were looking at a few moments ago, this one here, as you go through this video lesson, because oftentimes primary sources, or those written at the time that we're studying, include challenging or very specific vocabulary that even I, as your teacher, often have to look up. Sometimes it might just be vocabulary that is above the 9th grade level. Other times it might be very specific to the context, or it may be a term that is archaic. Archaic means that it is something that was used frequently, a word or a term that is used frequently in one historical time period, but that we no longer use, and so we're not as familiar with. All right, let's jump back in. So question number one, what motivated Mansa Musa to undertake this pilgrimage in the first place? Here's our first source, and you notice by taking a quick glance, can't help but notice that a few words are underlined, and then at the bottom in bold, it tells you the source. So you have a few things underlined here: retribution, alms, and fast. Fast we talked about previously in our lesson on the rise of Islam, and we said that that meant to abstain from eating or drinking. Retribution and alms are words that we have not seen before or we did not define previously, so those are going to be on your glossary. Take a moment to look at those now. Okay, so we see the source is Tariq al-Fatash, and unless you speak Arabic, that's not going to be a familiar term to you. It certainly wasn't to me the first time that I read through these sources. A quick Google search, however, tells us that it is the history of Timbuktu, written by Mahmud Kati in the 17th century. The word Tariq in Arabic means history. Now let's read through the source, remembering that we're ultimately looking to answer the question, what motivated Mansa Musa to undertake this pilgrimage in the first place. As for the pilgrimage, the reason for it was told to me by the student and keeper of the traditions of the ancestors, Muhammad Kuma, who mentioned that King of Mali, Kankan Musa, is the one who accidentally killed his mother, Nana Kankan, and he was sorrowful about this and regretted it, and feared retribution for it. So he gave large amounts of wealth as alms and resolved to fast for the rest of his life. All right, let's break that down for a second and make sure we got the key points from just this passage. So right off the bat, we see, as for the pilgrimage, the reason for it. Although the word order or sentence structure may be kind of unfamiliar or in our language, we clearly see that we're about to get information about the reason for the Mansa's pilgrimage. That connects nicely to our question, so we are paying close attention to what follows right after. We have a proper noun here. We have someone mentioned, Muhammad Kuma. And any time that you see a proper noun, particularly one you're not familiar with, when you are going through primary sources, it's a good idea to highlight them and then go back, and if you're unable to pull the information that you need to answer the question using the source, open another tab and do a quick Google search to say, who was Muhammad Kuma? Kankan Musa, in the parentheses right before this proper noun, we see that it's referring to the king of Mali. So Kankan is a word in Malian meaning king. But if you couldn't piece that together from the context clues or using background knowledge, which you might not have to be able to piece that together, you could again open another tab and say Kankan Musa, see what comes up to try and understand what does Kankan mean. Okay, and then you see Nana Kankan, and it tells us that is his mother. But once again, we want to make sure that anybody mentioned, we are putting into context so that we can understand the main idea of the source that we're supposed to be pulling apart. Let's move on to the next piece of this same source from Tariq al-Fatash. He asked some of the ulama, learned ones or scholars, of his time, what he should do to be forgiven for this great offense. One of them said to him, "It is my opinion that you should seek asylum with the messenger of God. May God bless him and grant him peace." That very day, he resolutely made up his mind, and he began to gather wealth and provisions for the journey, calling upon his kingdom on every side in demanding supplies and assistance. So once again, we want to make sure that we take a look at the underlined words. Those are on your glossary, and make sure that we understand what these terms mean to be able to interpret the meaning of this passage as a whole. Take a moment and do that now. Next, we want to highlight any of the proper nouns that we see that we might not be familiar with. So we want to make sure that we understand what the ulama, who are the Muslim scholars, right? What they are referring to when they say the messenger of God. And of course, in this passage, the ulama are suggesting that the Musa make the pilgrimage. The messenger of God, the last prophet, was Muhammad. Muhammad's birthplace and the founding of Islam is in Mecca. And so they are advising him to take that Hajj, take that pilgrimage to Mecca to seek asylum or seek safety and protection with the messenger of God, the Prophet Muhammad, in Mecca. Question number 2, we are investigating how do we know about the wealth that Mansa Musa's entourage gifted and spent along their journey? We heard a lot about this last week, and remember last week I told you that Mansa Musa very well may have been the wealthiest man to ever live. Today's wealthiest man alive has about 60 or 70 billion dollars in net worth. Mansa Musa is estimated to have had 600 billion dollars in his net worth. But how do we know? Was he really as rich as he's depicted? Let's find out. So once again, we have a news source here, and taking a look, we see at the bottom that we have Tariq al-Fattash again. That was that History of Timbuktu by Mahmud Kati, written in the 17th century. That'd be the 1600s. And then Tariq as-Sudan, which is the History of the Sudan, the same area, by al-Sadi, written again, the same time period, 17th century. Next, we're taking a look at the underlined words, and anything unfamiliar we might want to glance at our glossary for. Feel free to pause the video if you want to take a second to do that before proceeding. Let's read the source. Tariq al-Fattash states, the Mansa embarked with great pomp and vast wealth borne by a huge army numbering 8,000 people. Tariq as-Sudan is far more generous, allowing Musa made the pilgrimage with great pomp and a large group with an army of 60,000 men who walked before him as he rode. There were also 500 slaves, and in the hand of each was a golden staff, each made from 500 mithqals of gold. So we want to make sure that we note these sources. Move to the next page. Tariq as-Sudan attempts to quantify the amount of gold with each of 500 slaves in Musa's caravan, bearing a staff of 500 mithqals of gold, equaling 250,000 mithqals, over 2,000 pounds, nearly a ton. Ibn al-Dawadari, writing in the 1300s, wrote that the Mansa brought so much gold with him that he and his followers bought all kinds of things as though their money was inexhaustible. So once again, we want to make sure that any words that are challenging or new or very specific to the context, such as mithqal, that we define, whether on our glossary or not. Always can just open another tab and do a quick Google search so that we can make sense of the passage. We cannot understand what these sources are telling us if we do not understand what a mithqal is, if we can't put that into context, right? If we don't recognize the sources that we're getting our information from, we really can't say whether they are credible or reliable sources to tell us about the Musa's entourage or his wealth. We've seen Tariq as-Sudan. We look, and our news source highlighted here, Ibn al-Dawadari, is an eyewitness writing in the 1300s or the 1330s. So there's still questions to Ibn al-Dawadari's credibility, since we don't know more about him at this moment than an eyewitness. We might want to look a little further, do that quick Google search, see the first thing or two that comes up to see whether, you know, he would be a reliable source on the Musa's entourage or the Musa's wealth. But let's take a look now again at these sources here. I'll even go back one and relate them back to this question of how do we know about the Musa's wealth? Was he really as rich as he's depicted? Well, what are we getting from these sources? We see 8,000 to 60,000 people. That is a huge discrepancy, but either way, it is unquestionable that there were a lot of people in the Musa's entourage. There's a golden staff in the hand of each of 500 slaves, so that'll be 500 gold staffs and that's just what the slaves are carrying. And each one of those golden staffs is made from 500 mithkals of gold. So we're almost certainly all not familiar with the term mithkal. If we go back to our glossary, we see that it's a unit of weight meant to measure precious metals such as gold. And so we could surmise from the context that 500 mithkals seems like it's probably a lot. The next source then clarifies this, right? It tells us that 250,000 mithkals would be over 2,000 pounds. So if we know from our glossary that mithkals was a unit of weight and pounds is something we're far more familiar with, now we know we have a sense, or we have something to compare this 250,000 mithkals to. There's 2,000 pounds of gold just in the staffs that are being carried by these slaves, right? So that is why I want to use these two sources together to help us sort of put that together. And now we can apply that back to the question, saying, how do we know about this wealth? Well, we have some eyewitness accounts. We have the history of the Sudan and the history, the Tariq al-Fatash, all of them saying that the Musa had a large number of people in his entourage and that they were all carrying gold, and just the gold that they were carrying or adorned with was about 2,000 pounds of gold. Then Ibn al-Dawadari says there was so much gold, and this is of course more anecdotal than quantifying it or giving us numbers, but he says there was so much that what he observed is that Mansa Musa and his followers bought all kinds of things on their journey, such as in Cairo and then in Mecca, acting as though their money was inexhaustible, that it was limitless. Here we have another source to help us answer this two-part question, really, of how do we know about the wealth that the Mansa Musa gifted and spent along the journey, and was he really as rich as he's depicted? This one we see the source is Ibn Khaldun. And in this case, I haven't given you a bio because I would really encourage you to open up a new tab and just type in Ibn Khaldun. Remember, Ibn is Arabic for son of, and so many people's names will include Ibn in their names if they are Arabic. But take a look at who Ibn Khaldun was and consider whether you think he would be a reliable source on the Mansa Musa's pilgrimage taken in the 1330s. Then take a moment, as always, take a peek at the words that are underlined in red. These are on your glossary, and if they are unfamiliar, pause the video for a moment further and look them up on your glossary before continuing. Okay, let's read through the source and see how it helps us answer question number 2 at the top of your page. Ibn Khaldun recorded that the Mansa gave the Mamluk ruler al-Nasir Muhammad 50,000 dinars of gold, 50,000 mithkals or 400 pounds. Yet in another place estimates the Malians imported 80 loads of gold dust, each load weighing 3 quintars, with 1 quintar equaling 112 pounds. 80 loads translate into 26,880 pounds, or 13 tons of gold. All right, we've got to pause here, right? Because a lot of information, especially a lot of numbers, have been laid out. And even though this looks like a small chunk of text, there is a lot to unpack here. So first of all, we have Ibn Khaldun, right? That's one of those proper nouns that we always want to highlight and make sure that we can place him in context to understand his importance to the source. We then have the Mamluk ruler. Remember, Mamluk is one of those terms that is on your glossary. Al-Nasir Muhammad. So as long as we can define Mamluk, we can probably understand who this al-Nasir Muhammad is and his role in this source. Then we have to look at dinars and quintars, right? Because we've been given a lot of numbers here, and ultimately we are trying to answer the question of how rich was Mansa Musa really? How much gold did they have, right, in this entourage? So first, it's a bit anecdotal. It says that he gave the Mamluk ruler al-Nasir Muhammad 50,000 dinars of gold, meaning he had the 50,000 in the first place. But what is a dinar? How much gold is that? So we see in the parentheses the clarification that the 50,000 dinars would be 50,000 mithqals, or something probably more relatable to most of us, 400 pounds of gold. The next piece of information we get says that the Malians imported 80 loads of gold dust, which each weighed 3 quintars. Right off the bat, we should be saying to ourselves, we have no idea what a quintar is, but the next piece of the sentence clarifies that for us, right? So as long as we recognize that quintar is a unit of measure, the same way a pound or an inch or foot is a unit of measure, then we can put it into context. When we learn that 1 quintar equals 112 pounds, therefore, those 80 loads of gold dust that the Malians imported would be 26,880 pounds, or 13 tons of gold. And of course, we get that by saying each load of each of the 80 loads weighed 3 quintars. 1 quintar is 112 pounds. So each load would be 112 pounds times 3. And then you take that number and multiply it by 80 to get 26,880 pounds of gold. Here we have another source helping us arrive at our estimate of how much gold the Musa had, what the wealth of Mansa Musa and Mali really was. Take a moment, look at the underlined terms, make sure that these are terms that you recognize, and if not, use your glossary or open a tab to look up any unfamiliar terms so that you can interpret this passage. All right, let's read the source. Al-Umari, however, estimates that the Musa left his country with 100 loads of gold, some 33,600 pounds, or 17 tons. When the golden staffs of the 500 slaves are included, that total rises to just over 35,600 pounds, or 18 tons. Though only estimates, such approximations clearly convey an enormous amount of gold in transit. Okay, so once again, I have given you the source, but instead of giving you a bio, I recommend to you that you pause for a moment, open a separate tab, and look up Al-Umari. Just type that exact name into Google and see if you think that he is a reliable source of information that we should trust about the gold that was being transported in Mansa Musa's caravan as he made his pilgrimage to and from Mecca. Then we need to ask ourselves, what does this source add to what we have already learned or uncovered about the numbers surrounding Mansa Musa's wealth? Meaning, how wealthy he actually was. What testament does this provide? The information we get from this source is a comparison to the prior source, right? So if we were to go back just one and look at what we get from Ibn Khaldun, he said that there were 80 loads of gold, which would be 26,880 pounds of gold. Al-Umari, and we see however, so we know it must be saying a disagreement to something, right? However indicates disagreement, or on the other hand. So he's saying it's actually more, saying that the Musa left Mali with some 33,600 pounds of gold, and then says if you then factor in those gold staffs that each of the 500 slaves were bearing, so if you add those together with all of the pounds of gold dust that the caravan was hauling with them, they actually, in total, on this pilgrimage, had just over 35,600 pounds of gold, or 18 tons. If you're trying to wrap your head around these figures, keep in mind that 1 ton is about the weight of a small car. That means that Mansa Musa and his caravan were transporting an amount of gold that would be equal to about the weight of 18 cars as they made their journey on foot and on camels the 4,000 miles between Mali and across the width of the African continent to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. As you reflect on that amount and as you absorb that amount, think about how it helps us answer this investigation of whether Mansa Musa was really as rich as he's depicted. You might be thinking to yourself, yes, of course, this sounds like he was. And when I ask you all, make sure you cite evidence, make sure you back up your claim with evidence, this is the type of thing I'm talking about. So if you were going to answer this question, you would say, yes, Mansa Musa was absolutely as wealthy as he's depicted. It makes sense that he would be the wealthiest man who ever lived. According to Al-Umari, writing at the time of this pilgrimage, the Mansa's caravan was carrying an amount of gold that would be equivalent to carrying 18 small vehicles worth of gold with them on this journey. So finally, brings us to our third question for investigation. Where did all of this gold come from? Here we have another source from Al-Umari. Al-Umari's estimate that the Mansa Musa's caravan transported 18 tons of gold to Cairo and Mecca is well within the conjecture that Bure gold mine produced 4 tons of gold per year, and Bambouk gold mine produced 45 tons over 10 years. So, once again, we want to make sure that we look at these underlined terms and that we know what the word conjecture means in this context to understand the larger message of the source. Conjecture means to form an opinion based on not enough information or missing information. So it means that it's a pretty good guess, but it is not stating facts, absolute facts. In this case, if we were to put Al-Umari's statement into our own words, we might say that it is believed that the Bure gold mine produced 4 tons of gold per year, and the Bambouk gold mine produced 45 tons over 10 years. That those are our best estimates. And then the source itself is saying that Al-Umari's estimate that the Mansa had 18 tons of gold with them makes sense. It's believable because it is within these figures of what these 2 gold fields could produce. You'll see then that I included this map for you, but when you see this mention of places these proper nouns that you're probably unfamiliar with. The first thing you automatically want to go and do is look up a map. So the best thing you can do is type in Bure and Bambuk into Google and then just click on images and see what comes up, right? And I know that this image is talking about the right thing because, of course, it says these gold fields. I see Timbuktu, Janae, Gao, Teghaza, all places we've been talking about recently. I know that these are the right locations. And then I just want to put myself, take a second to put myself into the context and take a look at, okay, if Timbuktu is sort of the trading capital of the Mali Empire, where then are these gold fields in relation to that, right? And they seem to kind of be on the outskirts. I don't have more information at that point. I certainly could use the internet to further supplement my understanding. But at this point, I just want to make sure that I understand where those two gold mines are if I'm trying to answer the question, where did the gold come from? Here we have another source to help us answer question number 3. And at the bottom, we see that this primary source document, this excerpt of text, comes from Tariq al-Fatash and Tariq as-Sudan, those two major histories of Timbuktu and the Sudan that we have seen cited earlier in our investigation. We take a quick scroll through to see if there are any challenging vocabulary terms, keeping in mind that just because I haven't underlined something doesn't mean that there is not going to be a term that you get stuck on. So if you see a term like accumulation or acceleration and you're not sure what that might mean in context, you definitely want to take a moment, open a new tab, and just type that in, see what pops right up to help your understanding. Let's read the source. The Mansa's visit to Mecca therefore required years to plan and prepare. To gather so much gold would have required considerable investment in time and effort because there could be no acceleration in the accumulation of gold. The sources, Tariq al-Fatash and Tariq as-Sudan, are consistent saying Mali was not in control of gold mines, which would have been the newly developed fields of Bure and maybe Lobi, along with existing sources at Bambuk. Okay, lots of information there, even in this small excerpt, so let's unpack it. And the best way to unpack something like this is to try our best to simplify, to put it into as simple words as possible. Imagine that you are trying to explain what this means to a 5th grader. You certainly couldn't use a lot of these words, right? So you would have to put it into your own. And when we say put it into your own, we really mean as simple as possible so that anybody, regardless of their education level or age, would be able to understand. So first off, we're told the Mansa's visit would have taken years to plan and prepare. This wasn't something he could impromptu just, load up the caravans and get going. The next piece starts to tell us why. It would have taken years to plan and prepare because it would have taken a lot of time and effort to gather so much gold. Why would it have taken years to gather so much gold? Because there could be no acceleration in the accumulation of gold. What does that mean? Accelerate means to speed up, and accumulate means to gather a lot of, right? So you could not speed up the amount of the process of gathering gold. That could lead us to a question that is not directly answered here, although if we put this together with the last source, we can definitely use our context clues to answer the question ourselves. That is, why can't you speed up the gathering of gold? Well, The last source tells us that these different mines and these different gold fields only produce a certain amount of gold per year. There was only so much that could be mined or gathered from these different gold mines and gold fields. Once you've reached that amount that year, you can't just double it. Gold is not something that grows in the ground or that grows on trees, as we like to say. At this time in history, it was not something that we could manufacture or make ourselves. We had to find it in the ground. And so once you have depleted the source, there is no more available. You have to be patient. There's only so much output that those fields and mines can have. So in terms of question number 3, what we are learning to help us answer the questions that we have for this inquiry, right, is the gold mines are in Bure, Bambouk, Lobi. These are the 3 places where the Mansa would have gotten this gold. We know this because he had to take years to plan the trip to Mecca, where he brought all this gold with him, because these 3 sources of gold in the Malian kingdom or around the Malian kingdom only produce so much gold per year. One thing that has come up in this source that we should be asking and hoping to answer as we continue, and we're almost through, but it says Mali was not in control of gold mines. So in terms of the question, where did all this gold come from? That should be, alarm bells should be going off for you saying, wait a second, Mali wasn't in control of the gold mines? Then how did they get it? We've seen this source before, Ibn al-Dawadari. Keep in mind, he was an eyewitness writing in the 1330s, and I still recommend that you take a moment and look him up to see if you think that he would be a credible source for this information. But so now we're trying to figure out, where did all this gold come from? And we have in the back of the minds this another burning question, which is, wait a second, you just told us that Mali wasn't in control of those gold mines. So we're trying to answer that question to ultimately answer, how did Mansa Musa get this gold? The term Kadi is on your glossary, so be sure to take a quick look at your glossary, as I'm fairly certain you probably are not familiar with this term. Let's read the source. In the 1330s, Ibn al-Dawadari recorded a conversation between Mansa Musa and the Qadi Fakhr al-Din, in which the Mansa responds to a question about the location of the place where gold grows. It is not in that part of our land which belongs to the Muslims, but in the land which belongs to the Christians of the Chakr. Fakhr al-Din then asks the obvious. So let's proceed to the next page and read the second half of the source before unpacking all of it together. Fakhr al-Din then asks the obvious. Why don't you take this land by conquest? The Mansa's response. If we conquer them and take it, it does not put forth anything. We have done this in many ways, but seen nothing there. But when it returns to them, it put forth as usual. Musa's reply establishes that gold procurement was through tribute or trade, since more coercive measures proved counterproductive. All right, a lot to unpack here, right? So let's make sure that we're familiar with these terms. Procurement, gold procurement would be a way to obtain or gather gold. Take a look at your glossary to see what a tribute is. And we'll look at that a little bit closer in our final source as well. Make sure you are familiar with coercive. This is an SAT term. You're going to want to know this one. If something is coercive, you're describing something that was forced or that was done under threat of punishment. Coercive measures, therefore, would be measures to get the gold under threat or through cruelty or violence. And it says that those that doing that, that trying to get gold by threatening violence, was counterproductive. And you see from your glossary that the term counterproductive means a different result than what you were hoping for, or the opposite of what your goal is or what you intended. If we put this into our own words, we understand that our source, which was Ibn al-Dawadari, is recording, for history's sake, a conversation that took place, according to him, between Qadi Fakhr al-Din. We know if we looked up the word Qadi, that is a judge or jurist, right? We may not know specifically who Fakhr al-Din is. We might want to search that in a separate tab, why he would be talking with him. And then the Takrur is another one of these proper nouns that we might want to look up. And this is one that personally I would type into Google and then click images and look to see where this area is, because we know from context where it's saying it's not this part of the land, but it's in this land, that we're talking about a geographic location, right? And ultimately, all of this chunk of text is saying that this conversation gives us insight into the quotes, the place where gold grows. And of course, that is in quotations, because we know that gold does not really grow in the ground the way that corn or wheat might, but it's asking, where does the gold come from? And the Musa answers that it comes not from the land they control, but the land that the Christians control. So Fakhr al-Din asks what might be an obvious question, says, you're very powerful. Why would you not just go and take it, right? Why don't you take this land by conquest? And the Musa says, whenever we do that, it's counterproductive. If we try and take their land, when we go to the gold fields or we go to mine, we don't find any gold. In other words, he is really probably hinting at here that the Christians of the Takrur know the special skills. They know where to look for the gold. They know how to mine for gold. I don't know if you all know anything about mining for precious metals, but it's not as though you just see, gold bars sitting in a field or on the ground. It's often in dust form, and it can often be difficult it doesn't always, shine the way that you might expect it to based on the finished polished product. So you do have to know how to look and where to look. And so what we are finding out from this source is essentially that these Christians in the Takrur region, right outside of the Malian kingdom, that is not controlled by Mansa Musa, they are by no means as powerful as the Malian kingdom or as Mansa Musa, but the one sort of leverage they have is that they're the ones who know how to find the gold. And so Mansa Musa has learned that it is better to have them pay tribute in gold to keep the Mansa and his armies from invading them and taking them over, than try to just take them over and control them by threats and violence. Let's look at one more source that adds to this understanding. So al-Umari further states, the ruler of Mali has fixed a heavy tribute on the gold which is brought to him every year. Tribute, then, emerges as the primary mechanism by which gold flowed into Mali from the heathen countries. As the Bore gold fields were located between the Niger and the Bakoy or Semefe rivers, and to the west of the Kengaba, this would have been one of the areas of uncouth infidels. All right, again, final one here, and so we want to unpack this. We have heard from the source al-Umari previously, and once again, I would say if you have not at this point, Open a tab, search him real quickly, and think about whether you think he should be believed when he is giving us information about Mali and Mansa Musa. Then we want to take a peek at these terms and anything we're not familiar with. These are not on your glossary because now it is your turn. If you are not sure what heathen means, it is an adjective describing countries, or uncouth, or infidel. Take a moment, pause the video, and look them up in a new tab. Then, as we have with each of the sources, we want to use the information we have just read to answer the question at the top, where did all this gold come from? So Alumari is adding to the source we read previously, saying that the ruler of Mali, which of course is Mansa Musa, has fixed a heavy tribute on the gold which is brought to him every year. And so, therefore, we know that tribute is the primary mechanism by which gold flowed into Mali from the heathen countries. Putting those sources together, we can, at least for the moment, assume that the heathen countries refers to that land of the Christians, right? So we saw before that the gold comes from the land which belongs to the Christians of the Takrur. And if we go back to our source from Alumari, it says that gold flowed into Mali from the heathen countries. So it came from outside of Mali, or outside of the land that was controlled by the Muslims, and flowed into Mali from the heathen countries by way of tribute. So it's really important now that we have looked at tribute. So I'm going to pause for a moment and pull up this glossary again, right? Scroll down and make sure that if nothing else, you all have looked at tribute. It tells us that it is a noun, and the definition we have here for tribute says payment or dues made by a dependent state to the ruler of a controlling state. Remember that state refers to really any political organization that is subject to self-rule, meaning that it is allowed to govern itself. The United States of America is a state because it has its own government. When the 13 colonies prior to the American Revolutionary War, when those 13 colonies were under the British rule, we were not states, we were colonies, because we were ultimately part of the larger state that was the United Kingdom, that was Britain. So a state is anything that rules itself, and tribute therefore means that you have two states. One is much more powerful than the other. The less powerful state is going to make a payment or pay dues of some kind, whether in money or resources, to the powerful state for either protection or to keep them from invading. So we saw this actually in kind of the reverse with the Han, but whenever you see, tribute state, it means that we're talking about a place that if the powerful state, the powerful empire, kingdom, whatever type of state it is, if the powerful political entity wanted to, they could take over that state. But it's more beneficial to them to have this tribute relationship where that weaker state pays them not to invade, pays them to remain independent and self-governing. And so we are learning here in this source that the heathen countries, very likely again the Christian lands of the Takrur, are paying the kingdom of Mali, they're paying the ruler, the government of Mali, this heavy tribute of gold in order to keep their power to govern themselves and in order to avoid being invaded and conquered by powerful Mali, which they know, of course, if the Malian army did invade, they would lose. And that is why they are willing to give up their gold to Mansa Musa instead of keep it for themselves. That is where the Mansa gets the gold, even though the gold is coming from lands that are outside of his kingdom. And finally, we see a whole bunch of these proper nouns down here. And so what we really want to do to understand this location that we're being given is to pull up a map. And so the final thing I want to show you is this map here that I have grabbed for you all. And we can see very clearly, and this was, again, a very quick Google search to get this map. And we can see the Kingdom of Mali is this blue-gray color. Ghana and Songhai are also shown. But we can see that Mali was this blue-gray color. We can see the overlap goes around here. And we can see from these symbols on the map where the gold fields were. We can definitely see that they were just outside of the kingdom. And if we flip back between the description that we're getting over here, so between the Niger and then the Semefe River, so we see the Niger River is right here. And this map may be too zoomed out for us to see the Semefe River at this moment, right? But we can at least definitely see that that is the location of one of those gold fields and get a sense that it is, again, just on the outskirts of the land that is controlled by Mansa Musa and Mali.